Ladies and gentlemen, if you can't stop thinking about him, maybe it's not him you're really thinking about. That thought has probably haunted your days, maybe even your nights. But let me ask you this. Are you missing a person, or are you missing a part of yourself that you haven't yet discovered? Ladies, we live in a time where emotional independence is still misunderstood. Society tells us that if we can't stop thinking about someone, it must be love, fate, destiny. But what if, just what if, it's your soul whispering that something inside you still needs attention? Sinek once said, "Working hard for something we don't care about is called stress. Working hard for something we love is called passion." Let me build on that. Thinking about someone who doesn't contribute to your peace is not love. It's distraction. Sometimes, the thoughts that consume us are merely symptoms of deeper needs. The need for validation, connection, or unfinished healing. And that's where solitude becomes sacred. Solitude is not loneliness. It is the space where we meet our truest self. It is the room where we stop chasing love from others and start building love within. Personal growth is not about removing all thoughts of him. It's about understanding what those thoughts are trying to teach you. Every time your mind drifts to him, ask yourself, what am I avoiding within me? So if you can't stop thinking about him, this is what it means. It means it's time to start thinking about you. To all the women listening, never forget the love you seek isn't in someone else's hands. It's in the way you choose yourself every single day. There's something deeply unsettling about not being able to get someone out of your mind. That constant mental replay of their smile, the way they spoke, the little things they did, it happens in quiet moments, while you're brushing your teeth, waiting at a red light, or lying in bed staring at the ceiling. The same thoughts circle back. Why him? Why now? And why can't I just move on? We tend to interpret these recurring thoughts as something meaningful, something that must be telling us we're not over him, or worse, that maybe we missed our chance with someone we were supposed to be with. But in reality, when your mind keeps returning to the same person, what it's really doing is pointing at something unresolved. The repetition isn't always about love. More often than not, it's about incompleteness. The brain is not wired to let go of things that feel unfinished. We loop over what we don't understand, what we didn't expect, and what we feel we can't control. So when you can't stop thinking about someone, it may not be because of how important they are to you. It may be because your mind hasn't yet made peace with the story you've told yourself about them. This story might include moments you didn't get closure from, words you wish you had said, or situations that didn't go the way you imagined. And until you recognize that it's the lack of resolution that's fueling those thoughts, not necessarily the depth of the relationship, you'll keep mistaking mental obsession for emotional connection. People often talk about closure like it's a conversation or a moment you get from another person, but true closure comes from within. It comes when you make a decision to end the mental replays, to accept that some stories will never have perfect endings. That decision is uncomfortable, but powerful. The moment you stop looking for meaning in someone else's silence, you reclaim your peace. Sometimes the hardest part is realizing that your thoughts are not always a signal of deep love. They are a signal of emotional confusion. Your brain wants to solve a puzzle. It's searching for reasons, for logic, for understanding. And love, when it's real, doesn't leave us questioning ourselves every day. Real love feels safe. It brings clarity, not anxiety. It's important to know that not every person who takes up space in your mind is meant to stay in your life. Sometimes they're just a mirror reflecting your unmet needs, your fears, or even the parts of you that you haven't fully accepted. The one you're constantly thinking about may have simply triggered a version of yourself that you haven't met yet. And that version is trying to get your attention. So many people get stuck in this cycle because they confuse the intensity of their thoughts with the value of the person. Just because someone keeps coming to mind doesn't mean they're meant to stay in your heart. Sometimes it just means your emotional world hasn't found peace yet, and peace isn't found by diving deeper into the obsession. It's found by stepping back and asking, what am I really trying to feel through this person? That brings us to another important distinction that we don't talk about enough, the difference between who a person actually is and who we imagine them to be. Infatuation has a very clever way of clouding our judgment. We start building an ideal in our minds, a version of the person that aligns with what we crave. Maybe we see them as understanding, kind, or emotionally available. But we forget that sometimes these are qualities we're projecting onto them, not traits they actually showed. There's a psychological phenomenon where we tend to fill in the blanks with what we want to believe. When someone leaves an impression, especially if they withdraw without explanation or leave things unclear, we romanticize them. We start to imagine how good it could have been, how right it might have felt if only things had gone differently. But that imagined reality is not truth. It's desire dressed up as memory. And that imagined version of him, that's what your mind clings to. Not necessarily the real person. Not the late replies, the emotional distance, the inconsistencies. Not the way you felt confused or second-guessed yourself. Your thoughts aren't looping over who he was. They're looping over who you hoped he would become. We fall for potential. We fall for who someone could be if only they changed, if only they tried harder, if only the timing was right. And potential is a dangerous thing to fall for because it keeps us stuck in the idea of a future that was never promised. It makes us hold on to a person longer than we should because we're not in love with them. We're in love with possibility. There's nothing wrong with dreaming about someone. It's human, but we have to be careful not to build our hopes on fantasy. Because when we do, we end up breaking our own hearts, not because of what they did, but because of what we expected them to do. We hurt ourselves with the roles we assigned them in a story we never agreed on together. This is why self-awareness is so important. When you start paying attention to the why behind your thoughts, you can start to detach from them. You can begin to see that some thoughts aren't worth chasing. You don't have to believe every single one of them just because they feel persistent. Our minds can be loud, but they're not always right. Sometimes they just echo the pain we haven't sat with yet. When you notice yourself thinking about him again, ask yourself, what am I really missing? Is it the connection or the comfort? Is it him or the feeling of being seen and understood? When you start breaking down the layers of your thoughts, they lose their power over you. You begin to see that healing is not about forgetting someone. It's about remembering who you are without them. It's easy to think that moving on means you have to force the thoughts out of your head. But real growth comes when you're no longer fascinated by those thoughts. When you see them, acknowledge them, and let them pass like clouds in the sky. You don't chase them anymore. You don't fight them either. You simply stop assigning meaning to them. In the end, the mind thinks what it thinks. But you get to choose what you believe. And believing in yourself, more than in the fantasy of someone else, that is the foundation of every meaningful transformation. The human brain is remarkable. It's always working, even when we wish it would rest, especially when emotions are involved, and one of the most powerful forces it responds to is connection. We are wired for it. From the moment we're born, we seek faces, voices, touch, not just for comfort, but for survival, emotional survival. As we grow, that need for connection evolves, but it never truly disappears. It just becomes more complicated, more subtle. So when you find yourself constantly thinking about someone, especially someone you're not in contact with, or someone who isn't emotionally present in your life, it's worth asking a deeper question. Are you really thinking about them, or is your mind simply reaching for connection? When we feel emotionally alone, even if we're surrounded by people, our brain will reach for the last place it remembers feeling seen, heard, or valued. That moment, even if it was brief or imagined, becomes a reference point. It's not necessarily about the person, it's about what that person represented. Maybe it was safety, warmth, excitement, attention. Maybe it was just that they made you feel alive again in a time when everything else felt dull. The mind remembers sensations long after it forgets facts. It remembers how someone made you feel, even when you no longer clearly remember the conversations. And because of that, your thoughts will often return not to people, but to feelings. You just don't realize it in the moment. This is why persistent thoughts about someone can be misleading. You may interpret them as proof of deep feelings, even of destiny. But in truth, they may just be evidence of a connection your emotional self is still chasing. A need that remains unmet. A void that hasn't found a new anchor. That's the thing about emotional needs. They don't go away when a person leaves. They just become louder. And if you don't recognize that the noise is about the need, not the person, you can end up chasing ghosts. People who are no longer good for you, or maybe never were. There's a concept in psychology called attachment hunger. When our emotional needs aren't met, especially consistently, the mind begins to overvalue any source of perceived intimacy, even if it was brief or unstable. We assign weight to interactions that may have only been a glimpse of connection, because something inside us is starving for it. And like a starving person will eat whatever they can find, an emotionally hungry person will cling to any memory that once fed them. That's why your brain keeps going back to him. Not because he's the one. Not because it was a perfect match, but because something about the interaction triggered a feeling that you haven't found elsewhere. And until you understand what that feeling was, your thoughts won't stop returning to the last place they found it. This is not weakness. This is design. The human brain is designed to protect and preserve emotional connection, even if it means recreating it in thought when it no longer exists in reality. And that's where self-awareness becomes powerful. The moment you stop asking why you can't stop thinking about him and start asking what those thoughts are feeding in you, things begin to shift. There's also a deeper truth that many people miss. Just because someone is on your mind doesn't mean they belong in your life. The brain can be a tricky storyteller. It tells you that frequent thoughts mean deep feelings, but it forgets to mention that the mind also replays mistakes, regrets, confusion. Your thoughts are not a compass pointing to truth. They're simply data signals. And it's up to you to interpret them with clarity. You are not your thoughts. That's one of the most liberating ideas you can ever embrace. Just because a thought visits you doesn't mean it owns you. Thoughts come and go. They are shaped by your experiences, your hormones, your past, your mood, and yes, your unmet emotional needs. But they are not you. They don't define your worth. They don't determine your future. Think about how often your thoughts change based on your emotional state. When you're tired, everything feels heavier. When you're anxious, everything feels urgent. When you're lonely, everything feels more meaningful than it might actually be. That's why we must be careful not to let our thoughts become our truth, especially the ones that romanticize the past or overvalue someone who didn't truly see us. And yet, it's so easy to believe those thoughts when they're persistent. Repetition feels like truth. But in reality, repetition is just familiarity. The brain likes patterns. It holds on to thoughts that are familiar even if they're unhelpful. That's why the more you think about someone, the more your mind reinforces the belief that they matter. Not because of who they are, but because of how often you've let them in. It's a cycle. You think about him, you feel a rush of emotion, maybe sadness, maybe longing. Then your brain interprets that emotion as meaning, and the cycle repeats. Over time, that person becomes larger in your mind than they ever were in reality. You build a version of them that fits your emotional needs, a version that may be completely detached from who they actually were. And suddenly your thoughts aren't about a person anymore, they're about a symbol, a projection. The mind is powerful, but it's also prone to illusion. It tells you stories, and the ones you repeat become beliefs. That's why emotional discipline is important. It's not about suppressing your thoughts, it's about questioning them. About asking, is this thought serving me? Is it helping me grow? Or is it just keeping me emotionally attached to someone who is no longer here? There's nothing wrong with missing someone. It means you cared. But when missing someone becomes a pattern that distracts you from your life, from your growth, from your present, that's when it becomes a signal. A sign that you're ready to turn inward. To stop searching for connection in old memories and start building connection with yourself. Because the deepest form of connection is not with another person. It's with your own sense of worth, your own clarity, your own peace. When you stop identifying with your thoughts and start observing them, something beautiful happens. You gain space, space to choose, space to let go, space to reclaim your mind from a person who no longer belongs in your story. And in that space, you find something even more valuable than closure. You find freedom. We live in a world that constantly tells us to stay busy, to fill every moment, to be productive, to keep moving forward, to distract ourselves from discomfort with noise. We scroll, we swipe, we schedule, we stay connected. We do everything except stop, everything except sit with ourselves in silence. And because of that, many people are afraid of solitude. Not because they dislike being alone, but because they don't know what might rise to the surface when everything else fades away. Solitude has a reputation it doesn't deserve. It's often confused with loneliness, with isolation, with sadness. But solitude, real solitude, is not emptiness, it's space. It's space to think, to feel, to breathe. It's where we meet the parts of ourselves that we've been too distracted to notice. It's in those quiet, uninterrupted moments that we begin to understand what we really want, not what we've been told to want. That clarity doesn't come from noise. It comes from stillness. There's a reason why people often gain insight only after a breakup or during a time of emotional separation. When the constant external focus on the relationship, on the other person, is removed, we're left with the raw material of our own inner world. And for many, that's unfamiliar territory, but it shouldn't be. Because that inner world is where every decision, every pattern, every belief begins. That's the soil where identity grows. And without tending to it, we end up building our lives around people and ideas that don't actually fit us. It's in solitude that we realize whether we truly miss someone or just miss the comfort they provided. Whether we were in love with them or just in love with the version of ourselves we saw through their eyes. Solitude strips away illusion. It shows us what remains when no one is watching, when there is no performance, no validation, no feedback. That kind of truth is uncomfortable at first, but it's also liberating. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you know what's real, you stop chasing what's not. There's a strength that grows in solitude. The kind of strength that doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need affirmation. It simply knows. It knows who you are and what you value. It knows what you will and won't accept. It knows the difference between compromise and self-abandonment. But you don't develop that kind of strength by staying in constant connection with others. You develop it by learning how to be deeply connected to yourself first. Growth doesn't begin when someone else sees your worth. It begins when you see it yourself. And often, it's the quietest chapters of our lives that are the most formative. The ones where we feel the most lost are usually the ones where we're laying the foundation for who we're becoming. It's tempting to rush through those seasons, to fill them with distractions, new relationships, anything that keeps us from feeling alone. But that's a missed opportunity, because in those very moments of solitude, we're closest to transformation. We've been conditioned to believe that healing is about fixing what's broken. That growth is about reaching a destination, but healing is actually about discovering what was always there beneath the noise. And growth is not a destination, it's a relationship with ourselves, one that requires time, presence, honesty, one that deepens in solitude. Not because solitude gives us all the answers, but because it helps us ask better questions. Questions like, what do I really want? Who am I when no one is expecting anything from me? What does fulfillment look like if it's not attached to someone else's approval? These are not surface-level questions. They are not the kind of questions you can answer in between texts or while scrolling through someone else's highlight reel. They require stillness. They require you to be with yourself long enough to hear the quiet voice beneath the loud one. There's something powerful that happens when you stop waiting for someone to show you who you are and start showing it to yourself. That shift is what growth looks like. It's not loud. It doesn't always come with fanfare or visible milestones. Sometimes it looks like going for a walk instead of texting someone you miss. Sometimes it looks like saying no to an old pattern because you finally know your value. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace over attention. Personal growth often begins with discomfort. It's supposed to. Because growth is change, and change requires us to leave behind what is familiar, even if what's familiar is pain. That's why so many people resist it, because healing asks us to move through, not around, and solitude gives us the space to do just that, to feel fully, to reflect honestly, to forgive deeply, not just others, but ourselves, especially ourselves. But growth isn't a one-time event. It's not something you arrive at. It's a process of becoming, a practice of choosing. Choosing to see your past clearly, not with shame but with understanding. Choosing to take responsibility for your healing, even if you didn't cause the harm. Choosing to show up for yourself, especially when no one else does. And perhaps most importantly, choosing not to settle just because you're tired of waiting. When you spend time in solitude, you begin to notice your patterns, the thoughts that keep repeating, the stories you tell yourself about love, about worth, about what you deserve. And in that noticing, you gain power, because you can't change what you're not aware of. But once you become aware, you have a choice to continue the pattern or to create something new. That choice is the essence of growth. And here's the truth: no one talks about solitude doesn't make you forget about him. It makes you remember you, the you that existed before the relationship, the you that had dreams, preferences, instincts, the you that was whole even if you didn't know it yet. Solitude doesn't erase the past. It reframes it. It teaches you how to carry it with wisdom instead of weight. The path of growth isn't linear. You will revisit old thoughts. You will have days where you miss him. Days where you doubt yourself. That doesn't mean you're not healing, it means you're human. But each time you choose to return to yourself instead of reaching outward for validation, you strengthen the foundation you're building. And over time, those choices compound. They become confidence, they become clarity, they become peace. We've been taught to see romantic feelings as proof. Proof that someone matters. Proof that we should be with them. Proof that love is still alive. But feelings are not facts. They are indicators, signals, information, but not instructions. Just because you feel something strongly doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's healthy. It doesn't even mean it's real in the way you believe it to be. That's hard to accept because emotions feel so vivid, so consuming. But the truth is, the intensity of a feeling doesn't always correlate with the value of the person who triggered it. Feelings arise not only from connection, but also from patterns, from wounds, from unmet needs. Sometimes what we call love is really familiarity. Sometimes it's chemistry built on trauma, not alignment. And when you don't understand where a feeling comes from, it's easy to give it more power than it deserves. It's easy to let your emotions run the show, to use them as your compass. But if that compass is uncalibrated, it won't lead you anywhere you want to go. It'll keep pulling you toward the same kind of person, the same kind of pain, the same story with a different face. The emotional pull you feel toward someone, especially someone who isn't showing up for you in a meaningful way, is not always a sign of true connection. It can be a sign of emotional repetition, a pattern formed early in life, reinforced by previous relationships, triggered by uncertainty or scarcity. That longing you feel might not be for the person at all. It might be for the resolution of a story you've been trying to complete since childhood. That need to be chosen, to be seen, to finally be enough. But no one else can resolve that story for you. No one else can fill the emotional gap that was never theirs to fix. When you believe that love will heal everything, you place your healing in someone else's hands. You make them responsible for your peace. And that kind of dependency isn't romantic, it's risky. Because when they leave, your stability leaves with them. Your self-worth leaves with them. And you're left trying to rebuild from the rubble of a love that was never rooted in truth. Real healing begins when you stop using feelings as answers and start using them as questions. Why do I feel this way? What is this person activating in me? What story am I unconsciously trying to rewrite through this connection? That curiosity changes everything, because instead of reacting, you begin to reflect. Instead of chasing, you begin to understand. And once you understand the source of a feeling, you're no longer controlled by it. It's easy to mistake emotional intensity for compatibility, to confuse passion with purpose. But intensity without clarity leads to chaos. It leads to situations where you feel deeply but don't grow deeply, where you feel attached but not supported, where the high is high, but the crash always comes after. That's not love. That's an emotional roller coaster driven by unexamined wounds and temporary chemistry. When you begin to examine your feelings instead of blindly following them, something powerful happens. You develop emotional clarity. You begin to distinguish between what's real and what's unresolved. You see that sometimes the person you're fixated on is simply a mirror for your own growth. They showed up to reveal something, not to stay forever. And once the lesson is learned, the pull begins to fade. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understood what it was really about. This emotional clarity doesn't come from waiting for someone to come back. It comes from coming back to yourself, from learning to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of numbing them, from learning to validate your emotions without letting them dictate your choices. That level of maturity isn't easy, but it's essential. Because without it, you'll always be pulled in directions that feel familiar, but don't serve you. And there's another idea that challenges most people, the belief that loving someone means keeping them in your life. It doesn't. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is walk away, not out of anger or punishment, but out of self-respect, out of the recognition that not every person who touches your heart is meant to stay in your world. Some people are catalysts. They arrive to shake something loose in you, to wake you up to your own unmet needs. Their presence forces you to confront something. Their absence gives you the space to do something about it. Letting go isn't about erasing love. It's about choosing peace, choosing alignment, choosing to believe that real love, healthy love, shouldn't hurt this much. It shouldn't leave you questioning your worth. Doubting your value, shrinking your needs to fit someone else's comfort zone. Love isn't meant to feel like waiting, like confusion, like inconsistency. Those aren't signs of fate. They're signs of misalignment. And when you're clear on that, you stop holding on to people who don't choose you back. It's not weakness to love someone and still walk away. It's strength. Because it means you've realized that love alone is not enough. It's not enough without effort. It's not enough without reciprocity. It's not enough without emotional safety. And just because you feel something deeply doesn't mean you owe someone your continued access, your time, your future. You can honor the love without dishonoring yourself. We often wait for closure from the other person. We want them to explain, to apologize, to change. But waiting for someone else to give you closure is like waiting for them to hand you your power back. It's something you must reclaim on your own. Closure is not an external event, it's an internal decision. The decision to accept what is. The decision to stop rewriting the past in your mind and start rewriting the story you're telling yourself about what you deserve. The feelings will still come. You will still have moments of longing. That's normal. But they won't own you. They won't define your decisions, because you'll know they're just echoes of something you've already faced. And over time, those echoes will fade. Not because you force them to go away, but because you no longer feed them with false hope. Because you've given yourself something better than what you lost: clarity. Clarity doesn't numb the heart. It strengthens it. It teaches you that you can feel deeply and still choose wisely. That you can care for someone and still create distance. That you can be open to love without being ruled by longing. And when you reach that point, you stop chasing feelings. You start choosing alignment. You start building connections that don't just feel right, they are right. At some point, we have to ask ourselves why we hold on so tightly to people who let go of us so easily. Why we keep checking for signs, revisiting old conversations, waiting for something to change. There's a part of the human spirit that refuses to believe that something that felt so meaningful could end so quietly. So we turn it over in our minds again and again, looking for a moment we missed, a clue, a reason. But sometimes the reason has nothing to do with us, and everything to do with the season we were in. People don't always leave because something went wrong. Sometimes they leave because they were only ever meant to walk with us for part of the journey. The challenge is that our hearts don't work on a schedule. We invest emotionally. We imagine a future. And when that imagined future disappears, it's not just the person we miss, it's the version of ourselves we were becoming with them. That imagined life, that parallel reality, becomes the thing we grieve. And in that grief, we forget one of the most powerful truths about being human: we always have the power to return to ourselves. When we center someone else in our sense of direction, it's easy to lose our way. We start making decisions based on their reactions. We measure our days by their presence or absence. We silence our needs to keep peace. And in doing so, we slowly disconnect from our inner compass. Not all at once, quietly, incrementally, until we find ourselves looking in the mirror and wondering when we stopped recognizing the person staring back. But this disorientation can be a gift, because once you notice you're lost, you can begin to find your way back. Getting lost in someone doesn't always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks like compromise. Sometimes it looks like trying harder. Sometimes it looks like being the one who always reaches out, who always forgives, who always stays. But when you find yourself constantly proving your worth, constantly hoping they'll choose you, it's not love you're chasing, it's validation. And the more you chase it, the further away you drift from your own sense of value. Rebuilding that connection to self is not about becoming cold, it's about becoming clear. Clarity begins with observation. When someone's actions don't match their words, when their presence creates more confusion than certainty, when you find yourself anxious more often than calm, that's not chemistry. That's misalignment. And recognizing that doesn't make you cynical. It makes you conscious. Because love without clarity leads to confusion. It becomes a maze where you can't tell whether you're growing or just enduring. And relationships built on endurance don't evolve, they exhaust. Choosing yourself doesn't mean giving up on love. It means redefining it. It means refusing to call inconsistency romantic. It means no longer mistaking emotional highs and lows for depth. And it means asking harder questions: am I expanding in this relationship or shrinking? Am I free to express my truth? Or do I filter myself to avoid rocking the boat? Do I feel seen or simply tolerated? These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary ones, Because your peace, your growth, your integrity, they matter too. When we stop waiting for someone to circle back, when we stop measuring our worth by whether or not they remember us, something transformative happens. We reclaim our emotional agency. We begin to see that closure doesn't come from a conversation. It comes from a decision to stop romanticizing potential and start honoring reality, a decision to stop waiting for someone to choose you and start choosing yourself. Again and again, in big ways and small. This choice doesn't erase the memories. It doesn't suddenly make the emotions disappear. But it does create space. Space to reflect, to breathe, to rebuild. Space to explore the parts of yourself that were neglected while you were focused on them. And it's in that space that healing begins. Not the kind of healing that happens overnight. The kind that's slow, steady, internal. The kind that teaches you how to trust your instincts, how to speak your needs, how to recognize when something isn't love, even if it looks like it on the surface. It's easy to believe that if they come back, things will be different. That time and distance will bring clarity, that maybe they needed to lose you to realize your value. But holding on to that hope often becomes a barrier to growth, because while you're waiting for them to change, you're not changing. While you're hoping they'll come back, you're not moving forward. And the life that's meant for you, the experiences, the people, the opportunities, can't find you when you're standing still. There's a reason why some doors don't reopen. Not because they weren't beautiful, but because they weren't built to last. Some connections are bridges, not destinations. They help you cross something, learn something, shed something, and their purpose isn't to stay, it's to shift you. When we understand this, we stop seeing endings as failures. We start seeing them as inflection points, turning points that redirect us toward alignment, toward deeper authenticity. And that's where real empowerment lies, not in controlling who stays or who goes, but in deciding who you become in the process, in choosing to grow from the experience rather than shrink from the pain, in using the story not to stay stuck, but to rise stronger. Because your story is not about who left, it's about who you become after they did. It's about how you transform loss into self-respect, how you turn waiting into moving, how you stop looking backward and start walking forward, not because it doesn't hurt, but because you've realized you're worth more than what you're clinging to. And when you reach that place, something profound happens. You no longer chase what's inconsistent. You no longer settle for emotional breadcrumbs. You no longer confuse silence for mystery or distance for depth. You stop trying to earn love and start being love. And that shift changes everything. Because when you are rooted in your own value, you stop asking others to validate it. You stop accepting temporary presence when what you want is enduring connection. People will come and go. Some will leave without explanation. Some will stay longer than they should. But your job isn't to hold on to everyone. Your job is to hold on to yourself, to stay grounded in your truth, to protect your peace, to honor the lessons, and to keep moving toward the relationships that reflect your growth, not your wounds. And in doing so, you stop reliving the past and begin creating the future you deserve. One rooted not in longing, but in clarity. Not in confusion, but in connection. Not in who walked away, but in who you're becoming.